Good evening, everybody. I can see we've got a bit of a global audience tonight. Italy, Portugal, which is fabulous to see. Welcome, everybody, to our session tonight based around oracy and collaborative talk within the classroom. We'll start off with initial introductions. So my name's Christina Hingley. I am the product owner, the EAL product owner here at Twinkl. I am a former whole school EAL coordinator. I worked in an absolutely incredible school in Sheffield, working with learners from 11 through to 16, amazingly diverse, 60 plus languages spoken there, and I was in charge of their new to English revival program, as well as supporting within the community, teaching adults and parents and carers ESOL alongside that. For me, this topic is super duper interesting, and it's something that I could talk about for a very, very, very long time. So I don't want to bore you with that today. It's going to be very much a whistle stop kind of tour of oracy within the classroom. I've put some bullet points here of things that we are going to cover, that I will touch upon. I have tried my utmost to talk about strategies that are applicable for both younger learners, so EYFS, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and then your older learners, so Key Stage 3, 4 and 5, moving into further education, higher education, as well as learners who are a mixed proficiency bands, so those that are new to English all the way through to those that are competent in the language and need further support. So yes, as mentioned, the things at the top are what I'm going to cover in today's session. We're going to have a little look at some strategies that we can use to support our learners of EAL in developing oracy skills, as well as how to plan for oral development and collaborative talk for EAL learners. So first and foremost, I just popped some quotes on there that I thought that were really important from well-known English as additional language researchers, bilingual researchers. Ultimately, schooling it is a linguistic process, so it's the idea of content being presented and assessed through language. We have to make sure that students understand, and then they're able to use language that's both applicable to everyday situations as well as subject knowledge. Robin Alexander says, is the true foundation of learning. And the National Literacy Trust, their recent research shows that by the age of 11, spoken language skills are the most important indicator for literacy skills. So we're going to do a little bit of a poll to begin with. So I imagine that some of you here already have knowledge of BICS and CALPS, but for those that don't, BICS and CALPS were coined by Jim Cummins, who is a leading researcher within the field of multilingualism. And it's basic interpersonal communication skills. So that's your linguistic skills that you use on a daily social, on a daily basis, so social interaction. So I just put some examples there, like talking with friends in the playground, classroom language, interacting with teachers, and things like going to the doctors and chatting with the shop assistant. So my question is, how long does it typically take for learners of EAL who have no prior English language experience, who may be new to the country, international arrivals, how long does it take to develop proficiency in this? So what we're going to do is we're going to pop the poll up. Now, Jim Cummins indicates that it takes around 1 to 3 years for learners to pick up BICS, your basic communication skills. I like what Terry's put in the chat there, that she says she put 3 to 5 years, but it does depend on the needs of the child. So certainly, yes, hence the 1 to 3 years. It is very dependent on the student themselves and the environment that they're in and the additional support that they have within the classroom. So when we're talking about introducing basic communicative skills within the classroom and developing emerging oracy, we first of all need to have a think about the skill of listening. How do we actually teach learners of EAL to listen? We might have learners who are new to the country, who have different experiences of education systems from their home countries, perhaps where they haven't been able to develop listening skills, or they've not experienced the way that we have classroom talk here in our education system. Voice 21, who is a fantastic advocate, they're an organisation that's a fantastic advocate for oracy within the classroom, talks about, one of the most important ways to make sure that every voice in the classroom is valued is to make sure that students and staff are able to listen, and they listen in a meaningful way. So what we first have to do is we have to ensure that our learners know how to listen, that they are active listeners, and the reasons behind this. So I've just put a couple of examples of how we can do that with our new arrivals, those who are new to English. Diagrams of good listeners, making sure that they understand the words and the verbs associated with completing speaking and listening tasks. So I've put examples of like speak and listen, and make sure that they're aware of the actions and gestures that come along with active listening. So nodding along and agreeing, and eye contact, and things like that. And then Voice 21 have a really useful listening ladder that builds up from the bottom all the way up to the top. How we can start off with basic listening skills, such as giving 100% focus, being calm and still, giving eye contact, all the way up to the top of summarising the speaker's ideas. And that's for those who are participating in active conversation. So once we've introduced that skill of listening, I'm sure that a lot of you here will have come across learners who go through a silent period, particularly those who are new arrivals and new to the country, new to the education system. And the silent period is something to be expected. Often the silent period can last for several months. From my own personal experience, I had a learner who was a Mandarin speaker. I taught her for 4 years. She didn't speak to me for the first year, but that whole time she was actively listening and actively engaging in the activities that we were completing within the classroom. So how can we support these learners and encourage these students during this transitional phase? Maintain a dialogue even if there's no immediate response. Keep talking to them, don't just ignore them. Every time that you talk to them and they're involved in conversation with you, they are taking in all of that language. They are listening, and they're taking in that the new vocabulary and the curriculum content, and that they are actively listening. And I put there, ensure consistent inclusion in small group activities, make them feel comfortable, try to encourage them to speak within smaller groups. Acknowledge non-verbal communication, gestures, thumbs up, thumbs down, nods, hands up for stop. Gestures are all part of communication. Try and use first language. I will touch upon that a little bit later on. Structure lessons to promote peer interaction, and try and incorporate role plays and activities for language reinforcement. So things where perhaps they don't necessarily need to speak in it, but their actions are demonstrating some form of communication. So I've just put an example here of a lot of the examples that I've put in are scenarios that I have come across as EAL coordinator, or that I've sort of developed and adapted from things that I've seen. So this one is an example of teaching ancient Rome, Key Stage 2 primary school students, and they're conducting role plays and depicting various aspects of Roman daily life. So all of these will help encourage that learner who is going through a silent phase to participate in the activities, as well as communicate. So I put things like encouragement, peer pairing, using visual aids to help with communication, translanguaging support. So perhaps they're paired with someone who can speak a similar language, and that they're talking in their first language as opposed to English. And then lots of open-ended questions, giving the learner opportunities to respond in lots of different ways, not necessarily restricting them with closed questions. So once your learner has transitioned through that silent period, we're then going to have a little look at introducing everyday communicative language. So we're still on our BICS classroom language, and I'm not sure if any of you are members of the Nordic Association, and they have recently released their latest EAL journal. And Zoe Welsh, a well-known EAL practitioner, has written an article in it where she discusses everyday communicative language and how to teach this idea of survival language within the classroom. And I think this quote was really nice from her, where she talks about, English for school and the use of oral language. It can be easily taught by speaking clearly, indicating objects, people's places, giving instructions with gestures and miming and other visuals. And it's these really simple things that I think we forget sometimes, little changes that we can make as practitioners in the way that we speak and the way that we gesture and the way that we interact with our learners can make a real difference. I've put some examples of lots of different things that we have on site that can help with this. be that resources that you can do working with your TAs or HLTAs in small group support sessions, or that can be taken home and used as practice with parents and carers. All of these are in the reflection documents. So we've got things like conversation cards, really nice conversation dice that are new on site, and they're designed for older learners. We have interactive spinners that can be used on computers, they can be used on iPads or tablets, and then we also have other resources that are circle time talking games, barrier games, and things like matching jigsaws up, that really develop that basic communication. Alongside other really interesting resources that we've recently released are knowledge organisers, which develop language related to certain topics. So this one is based around places, has related nouns and adjectives, questions alongside sentence starters to prompt conversation and responses. Our scaffolding speaking mats, where it could be an educator and a learner, or learner and learner together, where they're using these as scaffolded questions with scaffolding sentence stems, alongside freer picture, scene and question descriptive cards. And like I said, all of these activities are super colourful, super engaging, and allow our learners just to practice that day-to-day language, asking questions, responding, and developing their all-round oracy skills. We describe this as comprehensible input hypothesis. So Krashen, a really well-known researcher within the field, developed the comprehensive input hypothesis, where he talks about learning a new language. It doesn't solely rely on the language itself. We use context, the knowledge of the world, to help us understand. So we build links with languages that we already know. For instance, I myself am a former MFL teacher as well, so I have knowledge of French, Spanish and Italian, and when I was learning those through school and university, I would often find links and cognates and words that were very similar to the English language to help build up my language skills. Things like visual supports and recognising people, dates, cultures, gestures, facial expressions. And it's this idea of having natural communication. It's really rich, meaningful, and we're teaching within a context. So I've just put some ways how we can put this into our classrooms, into our educational settings in really easy ways. So first and foremost, I mentioned being good language models, ensuring that we are clear when we're speaking, that we are slowing ourselves down if we need to make sure that we're understood, enunciating very clearly, trying not to use utterances. I know it can be quite difficult when you're in the classroom, but sort of breaking your sentences up with and and things like that do cause confusion sometimes and break the flow of conversation. Modeling explicitly how to talk and how to listen, as mentioned those skills before. Breaking down complex language, and then I also think it's really nice to get other learners involved as well, perhaps those who are speakers of the same language, so pairing them up as buddies, as well as involving your learners who are non-EAL speakers, so those who are fluent in English. The Hampshire services have an absolutely fantastic scheme called the Young Interpreter Scheme, where educational settings can sign up, and learners within those settings can become young interpreters, and they can work with new arrivals to help them feel welcome and support them on their journey into their new classroom. Things like homework clubs, conversation cafes. I myself used to run an EAL homework club on Friday lunchtime, and it kind of more turned into a board game club, where my learners would come along and they would feel comfortable having a conversation with each other, perhaps in different languages. We also had learners who were from like year 7 through to year 9 who would come and join, who were native English speakers, and that would, that general friendly conversation would help build, relationships and links, and my learners would become more confident in talking to their peers. And then I just put other bits on there as well about incorporating visuals and gestures to help understand, to support understanding and give a context for oral language input, and then repeat key vocab. So I thought, how can I demonstrate this, all of these things together? it's a little bit rudimentary. I came up with a little bit of an example conversation. So here we've got a scenario where we have a teaching assistant who's doing a bit of recapping with a learner around magnets and magnetism. And you'll see how, as we go through, I've highlighted the key vocabulary and the way that it's repeated and used in lots of different ways to ensure that the learner is pronouncing it correctly, is able to understand it in a context, alongside being able to use it themselves. I've also shown how we can incorporate different visuals to help support this, gestures, and also real life interactions. So, and the TA starts off talking about magnets and they point to the visual, so the word map, they point to the image on that. You know, the learner's able to say a magnet. We use that in a sentence. Great, what do magnets do? Magnets attract certain metals like iron. Exactly, you know, every little bit of progress that your learner makes, make sure you praise them. You know, we're not trying to constantly correct our EAL learners when it comes to them developing oracy and speaking skills. Any progress for them is fantastic progress. So constant praise of them using these languages, these words, sorry, in sentences is fab. So the TA introduces verb words. Let's talk about force. When the magnet pulls something towards it, tracks something, what causes this? She uses a gesture. So I just put a little video there of how the TA might be using a real magnet with paper clips. You know, excellent, now let's practice. Carries on, the magnet pulls the paper clip. That's right, the magnet attracts the paper clip. So she's introducing, rather than saying pulse, she's reusing that language, attract. And what causes this to happen? A force. Exactly. Can you explain how the paper clip has just moved using the word force, magnet, and attract? And you can see at the end, after that repeated use of the language, the learner is then able to use all of those key curriculum specific words in a sentence that uses high level language such as attract, and it makes sense, and it provides a context. And you know, this is really easily done. We call this micro scaffolding, so it's supporting learner a much smaller basis. So rather than planning scaffolding across a whole lesson, it's something that we do there and then to support our learners. So constantly developing the way that we're asking questions, which then links in with something I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, in how we can use questioning to help support oracy skills. An area that I really wanted to discuss, which I'm sure you will all be in agreement with, is the idea of play-based learning, and how play-based learning is essential for EAL learners. You know, it's an immersive and interactive experience that facilitates natural language acquisition, incredibly useful for EYFS. But it does also have a place in primary work with younger learners, as well as in secondary settings. I'm not going to read all of the examples on here for you, but I have highlighted some of the key things of how play-based learning can support oracy skills. So ultimately, it's predictable, it's repetitious, it's ingraining that language and those language structures into our learners' repertoire. In primary schools and EYFS settings, things like nursery rhymes and songs, games such as Chinese whispers, storytelling circles, Simon Says, word bingo, happy family cards, lots of ways where language is repeated and reused. And also, you know, that can be done in small groups or in pairs, and it's very much student-led. We then also have adult-directed play, so things with games, with rules, card games, matching games, and we have on site some really useful board game conversation cards and board game instruction cards that you can download and you can use with your learners to help express instructions with board games. So it's your turn, I win, thank you for playing with me, miss a turn, take a turn, alongside alongside barrier games. The examples that I've put on the bottom there are all taken from my teaching experience. So as I mentioned, working with my EAL group, and I often try to incorporate activities that involve movement within my EAL classroom. So you can see they're putting things in order, sequencing tasks. So that's one of my learners. We've been studying Macbeth, and we put the story in order across a big storyline in the classroom. Information hunts, I always, you know, like to get my students up and moving about, and they were able to talk amongst each other and talk with myself to find the information. interacting with the board, and then also I like things like I put there drama, role playing, presentations. So students teaching students, particularly with my older learners. So my Key Stage 4 learners who were, year 11 going on to college. I often got them to research topics beforehand, and they would stand at the front and they would teach each other, which they absolutely loved. It gives them that idea of autonomy, of being in charge of their own learning, and creating a sense of independence. So I know that ultimately I am going to be asked the question about phonics and how we can support learners of EAL with phonics, and so I have got an initial question. Pop onto the website again, and just pop in any ideas. So how does your educational setting approach the teaching of phonics and supporting EAL learners? And also, what challenges have you faced in implementing phonics instructions effectively? Wonderful. So I've just made myself a couple of notes of things that have been raised. One of the things that is really interesting to see on here is the discussion of vocabulary versus phonics. So I have put together here a little bit of information. The Hampshire services, who are very well known within the EAL community, have recently released a position statement on how we should support learners of EAL and phonics teaching, and it is incredibly useful to look up at a later date, especially for those who are talking about the idea of vocabulary versus phonics and who would like to be able to spend more time teaching learners of EAL vocabulary. The Rose report mentions that it is important to prioritise speaking, listening and strengthening English comprehension before introducing phonics. Particularly for learners who are in Band A, so those who are new to English, we should avoid additional phonics sessions initially. We need to make sure that intervention it is relevant for learners in order to grasp basic English oracy. So we should be building a strong vocabulary foundation and phonemic awareness to begin with, but not necessarily withdrawing them and teaching them phonics straight off. And it was really interesting to see in those responses how people were saying that it's incredibly fast paced, and I can completely understand that. We all have to teach certain things in certain ways by a certain time, and often we're trying to catch our learners of EAL up with this, but that they're able to pick up these sounds in lots of different ways, and I'll talk about how we can incorporate phonics teaching into everyday conversation with these learners. When it comes to Band B, so those that are moving away from being new to English, we can provide individual small group instruction for children, but it is important when we are teaching phonics that we're also teaching word comprehension, sentence construction, inference in these sessions as well. So I did see in a couple of those comments, people were saying how the learners are now able to hold a conversation and use full sentences, and that's how we should be doing it. Rather than teaching words as standalone words, we should be teaching them in longer sentences and how to use them in sentence construction. And it's important to set high expectations as well. Just because our learners of EAL are unable to communicate in English doesn't mean that they're not able to communicate fluently in their home languages. That they have all of this knowledge and this understanding in a different language. They just don't have the words to be able to express it in English. And so, popping them in, for instance, groups who we might class as lower ability groups, sometimes it isn't always suitable for our learners of EAL. They want to learn quickly, they want to and match their peers, and so it's important that we try and set these high expectations, and we pair them with good role models who can help support that. And it's key to build phonics into everyday teaching, everyday conversation. So things like sounding out classroom objects. So I put some examples of cards that we have online at the moment. So these are everyday classroom objects with accompanying sounds. You might be talking about, can you go and get that pen, and you sound out the word pen. Can you close the door, and you sound out the word door. Introducing sounds and useful words that start with it. So for instance, if you're introducing things like the you can introduce the word like mom, and other things like that. Day-to-day conversation, ask students to identify letter sounds, point to to certain letters within the classroom, or you know, certain things on the board perhaps, and get them to sound that out. And then, you know, integrating it into everyday repertoire, use rhyming words, songs, nursery rhymes. What does that sound like? What does that sound like? Just, you know, little things that you can pick up the learners can pick up on a day-to-day basis, rather than concentrated phonics teaching. I know that some of us here might be teachers of older learners, you know, in secondary settings. Some older learners will need additional phonics instruction. I used to run phonics sessions. I used to use Rewrite Ink myself with my learners. But it is important to bear in mind that these resources that we are using are age appropriate, be that illustration wise, content wise, subject wise. I think sometimes, well, I certainly found that a lot of my older learners felt like we were babying them almost, if we were using programs that were designed for learners who are in a primary setting. So perhaps encourage phonemic awareness tied to content instead. Dr. Katie Twinkl on Twitter is an ESL educator in the United States, and she incorporates phonemic awareness into the topics that she's teaching. So I've just put some examples here of, you know, I think she was teaching about life cycles and animals, and you can see there how she's created these charts that indicate the different sounds in that word, so for flying, for tail, and she would get learners to sound them out basically in each time the sound was revealed by removing the dot, and that's a really great way of introducing the sounds alongside vocabulary. So the second half of this session is going to be focused on moving away from our basic communicative language into something that we call CALP. So around 1 to 3 years to develop basic communicative language. CALP is language that we're looking at, that's more academic language. It's a higher level proficiency, and it's cognitively more demanding. Typically, this is language that you would come across when you move into secondary settings. And when I talk about CALP, I often talk about older learners, but this doesn't mean that this can't apply to primary settings, and particularly those learners that are, you know, developing competence of, you know, grade C and grade D on the proficiency scale, who do need intervention to help support them with higher level academic language. So this language can range from, you know, academic language, topic specific vocabulary, instructional language, subject specific equipment, for instance, in science lessons or maths, things like that. And it can be quite difficult to understand. It comes in various different forms. You know, some of the language is quite abstract and is very specific to a certain subject and can't be used outside of it. So I put 4 different scenarios on here, 4 different types of instructions from a member of staff in history, maths, English and geography lessons. And what we're going to do is on the next slide, I'll give you a minute or so to have a little read of these. And on the next slide, we're going to input some of the words that we think learners would struggle with in these instructions. So I'll give you a minute or so just to have a quick read of them. Jot some notes, and then I'll pop the next slide up and we can input our thoughts around this. Okay, so let's take a little look. So certainly in those small scenarios and the small instructions, you can see that they're absolutely chocker with language that our learners might find difficult. Things like equipment, like protractor, anthology, you know, instruction words such as interpret, analyze, subject specific language, metaphor. Yeah, we've got anthology on there. Thank you, Corinne. Society, source, revolution. It's, you know, for us as teaching, I think sometimes we forget when we're giving these instructions that a lot of the language that we're using is quite difficult for learners to understand, and so we need to bear in mind when we look at posing these questions what we first need to introduce beforehand. I'm going to quickly run through some strategies of how we can help introduce this key vocabulary. Well, first of all, I'm going to start off very much with topic specific vocabulary. So I do like to talk about translations, but I do like to put across a word of warning with these. Obviously, translations and use of home languages can be very useful for learners. However, they, number one, must be literate in their home language, so they must be able to read and write in it. And also, there are certain things that we would translate that, you know, the learner might not understand anyway, regardless if it's translated. So they might not understand the concept. They might not have they might have not come across it before. And so yes, definitely use with caution, but it can be used very much in a wider teaching or teaching context, and can be used for pre-learning and parental involvement as well. I've done things before where I've supported my science colleagues and created multilingual glossaries, dual language resources that the learners have taken home, discussed with families in their first language. Always encourage first language, home language use with parents and carers, you know, to talk about the vocabulary, its context, and to provide a translation. And then these are stuck in their books and used as guides throughout. And also as well, using translanguaging within the classroom. So Jim Cummins put it that to reject a child's language in school is to reject the child. So we don't want to solely be teaching in English. We want to use their full language repertoire to help support them in their learning. You know, it's well known that having skills and knowledge in an additional language can help support with English language learning. And translanguaging is where we use lots of different languages together. So, for instance, a scenario I always talk about is how in my school in Sheffield had a very large Roma cohort, and the Roma community can speak various different languages. You know, they come from various different countries, and I would have speakers who could speak Slovakian and Czech and Romanian alongside Roma, and often I would pair them together, and they would be able to use all four of those languages to converse, to discuss ideas, switching from one to the other, to the other, to the other, back and forth, and then using them to support each other in developing their responses in English. So I've just put another example of how perhaps Spanish speakers might use a mixture of English and Spanish to help support this language development in their classroom. So here we're working with a TA discussing the Great Fire of London. The TA is responding mainly in English. She talks about, you know, if you remember anything about the Great Fire of London, Manuel translates the question for the rest of the group. ¿Recuerdan algo sobre el gran incendio de Londres? You know, Elena answers in Spanish. She asks, ¿verdad? Is that right? Javier uses a mixture of English and Spanish. Eso es correcto. It started in, how do you say, una panadería? He doesn't know the word, but he knows the word in Spanish, so he replaces it with that. Manuel kind of knows what una panadería is. He doesn't know how to explain it. He doesn't know the word in English, but he knows how to explain it, something that makes bread. The TA is able to step in. Una panadería, yes, a bakery. It started in a bakery, perfect. And you can see how this develops, you know, the switching from English to Spanish to help communicate their knowledge. So, you know, if you aren't able to use translations and you aren't able to use translanguaging, perhaps you might just have a lone EAL learner within your classroom. How can we introduce this vocabulary in a different way? First of all, visuals and teaching a context. I used to teach vocabulary like this. I'll hold my hands up and say I used to teach it like this, standalone vocabulary. But for a learner, as I mentioned, a lot of this is quite abstract. For instance, chlorophyll, here we're learning about photosynthesis. Chlorophyll is a very abstract term, and without some sort of context, you're not really going to have an understanding of it. Trying to introduce language in full sentences, in sentence structures. Plants absorb sunlight, and then this moves on to plants taking water from soil, where that key vocabulary is highlighted and incorporated into a sentence that explains the process, or that they're able to reuse when they're recalling that language. And you can see here, I put a bit more description for chlorophyll. It's a green pigment. It captures sunlight energy, and I've used an image there. And learners are able to see this process of how all of these words in this language links together. And this can be done in many different ways for many different subjects. You will often find links between languages. And then how do we drill this language and ensure that we're repeating it in a way that learners are able to use it themselves orally? Again, I'll put a couple of different scenarios here of how we can use that language, using play and games. we all know how the game of I went to market and I bought an avocado. I went to market and I bought an avocado and a packet of biscuits, where the learners repeat that language. You can do that with topic-specific vocabulary. Here I've got an example with volcanoes. I went to the market and I bought a volcano that contains lava. I bought a volcano that contains lava and ash. And then Juan adds on lava, ash and rocks, and then that continues as they're repeating that topic-specific vocabulary. Word association is great. Here I've got my learner David. He's an EAL learner. He's got his two friends, Emily and James. They're fluent in English speakers, and they're linking language together. They've probably been pre-taught this already. The teacher starts it off, but then it is very much collaboratively amongst the learners. Electricity circuit. Oh, James knows that links with wire. Oh, Emily says, oh, we attach the battery in the circuit with a wire. Oh, current flows through the wire. And it is building those links between language. And then another scenario is the use of substitution drill games. So this is where students work with a teaching assistant, perhaps, or it could be the educator within the classroom. And it's about repeating and modifying sentences. So you can see here the teaching assistant takes the lead. We're learning about the respiratory system. Teaching assistant says oxygen. Students repeat oxygen. The lungs taking oxygen, the lungs taking oxygen. And then the TA gives them a different word that they have to substitute. So they're going to change the sentence from the lungs taking oxygen. They're going to substitute carbon dioxide. And you can see that the learners are able to say the lungs release carbon dioxide. And it builds on this. It's that idea of repeating the vocabulary, of being able to modify the sentences and use it in a context. I'll just put a couple of examples how we could also reinforce that vocabulary more of a written form. Vocabulary cards, synonym better word ladders, clines, to indicate how else we can refer to synonyms and different words, and then a vocab journal. It's always useful to have things like this to take home to revise and to practice with parents and carers. And then we have different word forms and functions. It is, it's important to remember that when we are teaching them a word, so I use photosynthesis here as an example, that it comes in lots of different forms. We know photosynthesis is just a noun, but it can also be a verb, and it can be an adjective, and it can be an adverb. And understanding how these different words function, it can be confusing for our learners of EAL who aren't particularly familiar with the grammatical rules of English. They might struggle to construct sentences using these different word forms, and learning and memorizing all of these can be quite overwhelming. So as good role models of language use, it's important that we try to slip these into our questioning and when we're providing model answers. So I just put an example of here how we can use those different vocabulary forms at every opportunity to make sure that they're ingrained, be a good language model. You don't have to explicitly teach them. If you just slip them in, learners will start to pick them up. So you can see the different ways that I've used photosynthesis here, but then I also incorporate photosynthesize, photosynthetic, as well as photosynthetically, and the learner is able to repeat those back. So I haven't got much time. I've still got just a couple more bits and bobs to talk about. So we've talked about introducing that vocabulary that's subject specific, but it's important that our able to understand that our learners are able to understand academic instruction vocabulary. We're all very aware of Bloom's taxonomy and how the 6 cognitive skill levels, they provide a structured framework, and they develop higher order skills. And I just put a quote there of how research suggests that there's a quantitative and qualitative step change in language when you move from into secondary school compared to primary school. So particularly for those who are teaching learners, older learners, it's sort of a double whammy, really. Our learners have to develop oracy skills in a completely new language, but also in a completely new subject. So it can be quite difficult. So how do we support our learners with this? How do we get them to respond? How do we build classroom talk using this higher level language? What we really want to avoid is closed questioning, initiate, respond, and feedback style questioning. We want to ensure that we can facilitate enhanced conversations, make learners feel comfortable to answer through targeted questions. So, building ideas. Do you agree with? Can you add to what Sarah just said? For clarifying information. How could you explain why? And for supporting ideas, can you give an example of what would I write next? These are really nice, simple ways of introducing conversational talk within the classroom, as opposed to using these more difficult words such as interpret, predict, compare. This is a nice way of introducing it. And I just put some bits on the bottom there about how we can ensure that our questioning is appropriate. So as I mentioned, be a good language role model, recast, rephrase language that the learners provided responses. Cold calling, when you pose your questions to your learners of EAL, make sure that they're appropriate for their language level. You can use peers to help support them with answering those questions. And then also use them to check understanding. So prompt your EAL learners to summarize text, get them to repeat instructions that you've given, express agreement or disagreement. Yes, I agree with, no, I don't agree with, and justify their work. So how can we support this? Sentence starters is one way. These are just lots of examples that we have on site. These can be cut up, they can be printed as word mats, they can be stuck onto lanyards, they can be flashcards used within the classroom. And these provide a structure for how learners can answer questions. They can respond to questions using that higher level language. They're often split into different sections, so things like opinions, adding information, agreeing. And when I've tried to do this previously with a lot of my own learners of EAL, these might be a bit small on the top to see, but I've almost developed a bingo style card. So I would print these off for all of my learners. They would have them in front of them, and when I cold call on them, they would be expected to use some of this language off their bingo card, and we would turn it into a competition, so we could see who could use as many of these phrases as possible within the session. And when it was all ticked off, they got a prize for doing it. And it's just that use of language, that development of language in a really fun way. We can also use substitution tables and anchor charts for those learners who aren't as comfortable with their language. So we might not have come across substitution tables, but they are an incredibly useful strategy where you can provide different options for learners to select. So these ones are taken from our brand new curriculum scaffolding packs that we have on site for history, geography and science. And I might ask the question, okay, so what is the mouth of a river? And from here the learner is able to pick the different sections that work with each other. So the mouth is the start of a river, and they can build up their sentences using the different columns in the substitution tables. Anchor charts are really useful as well. Again, I put some examples from Dr. Katie Topple. She seems to be an expert at anchor charts. She uses them all the time within her classroom, and here she categorizes language in different columns. So have, can, are, and uses this to build sentences. So you can see here we're talking about polar bears have, polar bears can, polar bears are, and from having this interaction with learners, this classroom talk, this conversation to build the language, they're able to put it into sentences. Again, some talking prompts here of how we can prompt our learners with sentence starters. So how do we build this into our writing, into other skill areas? The Bell Foundation has a really fantastic guidance on how we can move from talk to writing, using classroom talk to support writing. So this is the idea that learners already practice vocabulary and language structures before they actually start writing. So rather than us just expecting learners to be able to write longer pieces of assignments, longer pieces, paragraphs, for instance, and we're able to give them that support beforehand using classroom talk and oracy. So it's this idea of pre-teaching vocabulary, building knowledge of the topic's context, sharing as a full class. Perhaps that might be reading text models, jointly constructing text through shared writing. So you can see an example there of mind mapping as a whole class, graphic organizing, things like that. This idea of collaborating with peers and with educators to share ideas, to build confidence and understanding, to then use that as a guide, as planning to help with writing. Another really useful technique that I've seen is having learners use dictaphones or recording buttons to actually just record their ideas. So they speak into them, as if they're just chatting away with each other. They're recording it in a group, perhaps with lots of input, and they're able to listen back to these to then pick out their key points to use as, again, as a guide for their writing, and to help them basically remember the things that they've said. You know, they might find it difficult to write it down, write their oral ideas down, but if they're able to verbally express them, they have them there and then to use. So finally, how do we plan for all of this? I know I've shown you lots and lots of different strategies that you can use. There is no expectation that you try and use all of them in one lesson or all of them in one go. You know, using one of them successfully will have as much as impact as using, you know, 5 successfully in one go. So how do we plan adequately for classroom talk and oracy? So Pauline Gibbons produced a planning framework in her book, Learning to Learn in a Second Language, that where we identified the demands, the language demands, the spoken language demands, the listening demands that learners will have when it comes to the topic that's being introduced. And I've just drawn an example here, again, based on photosynthesis. And her table, her planning table is a really simple one. You can just, you know, you don't have to do it typed like I've done here, but you could be drawn up on a Post-it note or a piece of paper. And Pauline Gibbons' one includes the topic, the activities, language functions, language structures, vocabulary. I've added 2 additional columns for example questions and additional resources to help with this session. But you can see how we build from the general topic of photosynthesis to include an aim, the different type of activities. So here, vocabulary recall, oral planning, questioning and whole class modelling, and doing the big write, the types of questions that we might come across, highlighting, you know, keywords, things that learners might find difficult. What language functions will they need? So they're going to be need to describe, to explain, to clarify, identify. And what language structures might they struggle with? Passive voice, perhaps, or do our learners know how to order things correctly? Do they know how to use connectors for cause and effect, comparative superlatives, the key vocab, and then also the additional resources. So here to support my learners with oral planning, we're going to use word maps and sentence starters and visual organisers, dictaphones to help record ideas. You know, questioning and whole class modelling, we might use whiteboards to help support with that, and then moving on to the big write. And like I said, this framework is incredibly flexible and it can be interpreted in lots of different ways. Like I said, you didn't have to do it as complicated as I've done it here. You can just jot quick notes, but it is really useful to look at beforehand before you approach teaching your learners of EAL, to recognise what exactly it is that they are going to struggle with, and you can preempt that before you know, you come across it in lesson and aren't 100% sure of how to tackle that. So to finish, I've just put a couple of a couple of organisations on here who are really, it is worth checking out. Voice 21, as I mentioned before, Bell Foundation and Naldic. Dr. Naomi Flynn has got the Talk Rich Teaching Project, which she's been working with the University of Reading, really interesting, based on a lot of ESL, you know, schemes in the United States. The Collaborative Learning Project, very much focused on talk for learning activities. And yeah, just, you know, have a check of these in your own time. Lots of great resources on there that you can use to support your learners of EAL, and to help support develop classroom talk. So that's it from me for today. As mentioned, a very much a whistle-stop tour of collaborative talk within the classroom, but I really do appreciate, thank you all for your time and also for your participation and your wonderful ideas. It's been fantastic to see how you're all getting on with your learners of EAL, and incredibly encouraging to see the support that they have within the classroom.